The Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation. Sometimes it's translated as the book of formation. It's a key Kabbalistic text commonly attributed to being written by Abraham. However, that's also disputed by Kabbalists, and we'll get into that a little bit in this lesson. But before we get into it, we have to understand that there are many ways of viewing such a book. We're going to look at this book through the lens of authentic Kabbalah. What does it mean through the lens of authentic Kabbalah? It means that we're not here to just come and get all kinds of interesting tidbits of information, to make some interesting connections, have some nice aha moments. But authentic Kabbalah has a certain goal, meaning that Kabbalah in its authentic form is a method of developing a person from this world that we're all born into, that we know with our five senses, and to elevate us to a higher perception and sensation of reality, one where we are adhered to the single causal force of nature called a force of love and bestowal. In the wisdom of Kabbalah, that force is called the Creator, from two words, Bo Ure in Hebrew. The word is Bore for creator in Hebrew, coming from Bo Ure, meaning come and see, meaning that authentic Kabbalah aims to develop us until we reach a state of attainment of that single force of reality. And when we attain that single force of reality at its source, we start seeing how it concatenates down through many sub-forces, subsystems, and that's also what's written about in Kabbalistic books, such as Sefer Yetzirah. So we're going to look into that today, and when we're looking at it from this authentic Kabbalah perspective, we need to understand that we're always looking at it from the perspective of how does this book come to be useful toward us today? In what lineage does it come to us? And there's a lot in this book, but we're going to get into it in a very specific way through this authentic Kabbalah lens, and that's what we're going to get into, as we do with all of our Kabbalah Explained Simplies. Okay, first let's take a look at the lineage of how the Sefer Yetzirah fits in among major Kabbalistic texts, because it is considered by Kabbalists as one of the key and major Kabbalistic texts in the lineage down from the first Kabbalistic text all the way down to our era. So the very first Kabbalistic text, if we're looking at the development of major Kabbalistic texts throughout history, is called the Angel Raziel. It's called the angel being a force in the wisdom of Kabbalah, so it's like this secret force. Raziel is like secret, so secret force. It's talking about the one single force behind everything that creates reality, the force of the Creator, that force of love and bestowal, as it's attained by us who seek the meaning of life, who come to research on ourselves in order to endeavor beyond our current perception and sensation of reality in our five senses, and rise to a perception of reality above any perception of separation, above any perception of transience, to a perception that is eternal, that is perfect. And there we discover that there is a single omnipresent force that's constantly in a mode of bestowal and love toward these created beings, towards this creation that it created. And that's what these Kabbalistic texts, and starting from the Angel Raziel, they come from. That was written 5,784 years ago it's attributed to being written by HaRishon. And when we're talking about Sefer Yetzirah, we're talking about what is commonly associated as a second major Kabbalistic text that's written throughout history. Sometimes we hear it regarded as the first, similar to how we sometimes hear about Abraham being regarded as the first Kabbalist, because from Abraham's era onwards, that's when Kabbalah really started becoming expanded throughout society as a method that many people started studying and applying to themselves and using in order to attain that single force of love as it's revealed to us people in our world through what's most commonly known as that tenet of love your friend as yourself, or love thy neighbor as thyself. And people would attain these spiritual revelations and attainments through this method that Abraham brought the people back then. Whereas in HaRishon's time, it was done simply by an individual. So, as we said, it's commonly attributed to being written by Abraham. There's many disputes about this in the wisdom of Kabbalah. The disputes are actually they're beneficial. Kabbalists never discuss the disputes on certain matters as being something that is negative, but rather something positive, that it adds to the scrutiny and adds to the examination of what eventually helps us rise from this world upward. So we'll get more into that later, but for now we'll just go by the common lineage, where we attribute the Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation, as being written by Abraham around 4,000 years ago, and we continue with Moses' Torah 3,000 years ago, also a Kabbalistic text. One of the major differences, and you could say innovations, with the Sefer Yetzirah compared to the Torah is the language. Sefer Yetzirah is written in the language of Kabbalah, which is the language that today we also study from later texts, which we're also going to describe here. And that's why it's important that if we're talking about Sefer Yetzirah, that we're also putting it into this lineage, that we can see how these languages develop and concatenate down from the earliest Kabbalists and from their writings to our era. So the Torah is written rather in what's called the language of branches, meaning all kinds of stories, fables, legends that we can read and understand even in a corporeal context. Whereas with the language of Kabbalah, it speaks to precise spiritual formations, structures, terms such as Sefirot, which describes specific spiritual structure. So that's a key difference here between the two kinds of books. Moses' Torah obviously was written at a time when the expansion of this method was in the masses much more at that time than at Abraham's time. Then we continue around 2,000 years ago with Rashbi, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, being attributed to writing the Zohar. Of course, we know that he also wrote that text together with 10 Kabbalists, 10 friends who wrote that book of Zohar in a cave. There's lots of material about it on our channel. We're not going to get too deep into it now. And one of the important things here about all these Kabbalists that we're seeing, and we'll continue now with the Ari and the Tree of Life and his writings, which was in the 16th century, and Bala Sulam, who wrote the Sulam commentary and the study of the Ten Sefirot, TAS, short for Talmud Es Sefirot, as we said, the study of the Ten Sefirot. So why do we put out this lineage first and foremost? It's because Kabbalists, meaning those who view the wisdom of Kabbalah through this authentic Kabbalah lens, as we talked about, they recognize that there is this single soul among all these Kabbalists. They all shared the single soul. What are we talking about when we say a soul in the wisdom of Kabbalah, and that a person has a certain soul or attained a certain soul? So these Kabbalists, Adam HaRishon, Abraham, Moses, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the Ari, Kabbalist Isaac Luria, as we know him, Bala Sulam, or Kabbalist Yehuda Ashlag, as we know him, it is said by Kabbalists that they all shared the same level of spiritual attainment, which is the highest level of spiritual attainment that a person can possibly attain from this world up into the spiritual world. It's called the full 125 levels of attainment. You'll also hear it referred to as the individual Gmar Tikkun, or the individual end of correction of a person's soul. And that's why we consider these Kabbalists and this concatenation down, this lineage, as being a very important one, because we say that a person attained a certain level of spiritual attainment. That's what it means by soul. Soul, in a very simple definition, is where a person feels pleasure and how a person feels pleasure in their desire. So you can say that we, in our corporeal, animate lives, our souls are not yet spiritual ones, because spiritual is defined by bestowal and love, a pure quality of bestowal and love, where there is no shred of egoistic intention attached to it. That is considered spiritual, whereas corporeal is the opposite, where we intend to benefit ourselves alone. And the corporeal nature is the one that we are born into. In the wisdom of Kabbalah, it's called the level of this world. So from this world, we are given a certain method called the method of Kabbalah, through which we study what's called the upper worlds and these upper structures of spirituality, the Sefirot, the parts of Him, the worlds, as they concatenate down into our world. And as we said earlier, it's all for the purpose of drawing forces from those worlds. It's not for the sake of connecting all kinds of interesting intellectual knowledge, but it's rather for the sake of drawing the forces from those spiritual worlds, what's called drawing the light. Not light as we know it as physical light, or light in terms of the light of contentment we feel upon resolving a certain doubt, but rather light as defining the spiritual force of love and bestowal as it extends from the source force of nature, that the wisdom of Kabbalah, that Kabbalists call the Creator, short, as we said, Boreh, come and see, the Creator meaning that it's an active definition in Hebrew, that we come and see, we know the Creator through the attainment of the Creator. The wisdom of Kabbalah is all about attaining and placing names on all kinds of phenomena, objects, structures, processes that we attain, and that's what Kabbalists write about in their books. So it's all about that attainment of that spiritual, you could say, realm, although it's not a physical place. Spiritual is beyond the physical. So the soul is that place where we feel pleasure. So beyond all our animate, corporeal, you could say transient places where we feel pleasure, which as we define in our lives are food, sex, family, money, honor, control, and knowledge. We get a tiny spiritual point of desire called the point in the heart, through which we develop and nurture. And that is what we nurture and develop through the study of the wisdom of Kabbalah, and the forces that we draw from the study develop that point until it crosses a certain barrier between the egoistic shell that we are in and the altruistic force that exists outside of us. And when we make that breakthrough, it's called crossing the barrier or crossing the machsom, meaning barrier in Hebrew. So when we make that breakthrough, we enter the perception of that single force and how it divides and concatenates down through many sub-forces and subsystems down into our world. And then we have the perception of what these Kabbalists wrote about there. And that soul that we attain is a soul where we feel pleasure not for personal benefit alone, which describes all those pleasures we talked about earlier, food, sex, family, money, honor, control, knowledge, but it's a place where we feel pleasure through bestowal and love that aims at bestowing to the whole system we are in all these, as we said, subsystems and processes, and really you can say through all people in humanity, but not just to the people corporeally as we perceive them, but to their innermost desires that we bestow and love to and through all those points, back to that single one force of nature called the Creator. And when we enjoy at that point in the most complete manner possible, it's considered that we attain that state of the end of correction. And that's that soul that we're talking about, that all these Kabbalists are from that same soul, and they write to us from there. So it's important getting that introduction, because there are many texts in the wisdom of Kabbalah, and there's also many ways of interpreting these texts. But when we're talking about it from the perspective of authentic Kabbalah, so we're always looking at it from that perspective, that there's these major texts and there's this major lineage, there's this development of languages. As we said, Sefer Yetzirah was the first text that was written in the language of Kabbalah. The Torah deviated from that language. Deviated is a wrong way of saying it. It was just written in a different language because of the different desires at the time. The other important thing, what's this expansion here? Like, why does this get bigger? That's representing the bigger desire, because the development of the Kabbalistic language and the texts over history is defined by different levels of desire that those texts were written upon. So when we say that the Sefer Yetzirah was written in the language of Kabbalah, we also have the Ari's Tree of Life and the other Ari's writings also written in the language of Kabbalah. After we went through the language of branches and after we went through the language of legends with the Zohar, so we return to the language of Kabbalah. And Baal HaSulam also continues in the line of the language of Kabbalah. What's special here? What's unique about this language of Kabbalah that was introduced in Sefer Yetzirah, or by what was attributed to being written by Abraham, and how it comes back to us in our era? And what does it mean that at Abraham's time it was written upon this smaller level of desire, and in our times it's written and elaborated on a much bigger level of desire? So in Abraham's time, as we know, Sefer Yetzirah is a very short book. It doesn't go into much detail. There's actually not too much we can get from it in our times today. If we're really interested in learning the wisdom of Kabbalah and applying it to ourselves, and as we said, learning the wisdom of Kabbalah doesn't mean assembling intellectual knowledge to ourselves, but it means that we learn the wisdom in order to draw the forces from the wisdom. And those forces that we draw, it's what's called drawing the surrounding light to ourselves, to our desire within us. So the texts that are most suitable for us in order to draw the forces specifically in our era, which is defined by this much bigger desire, because we can see it upon ourselves even now, that compare it to you don't even have to go back 4,000 years, even just go back 50 years from now and look at, for example, programs on TV compared to what they are today, and you can see how much bigger and more excessive and expansive our desires are compared to those of the past. It's even unfathomable for us to think about what size of our desires were back 4,000 years ago. We don't even have that kind of perception. But back then we had much smaller desires, and those texts were written for people upon those much smaller desires. So there's not much we can get from these books today. Also, since we had smaller desires back then, we were also much closer to the perception and sensation of the spiritual world, because we didn't have this huge egoistic desire that was separating us from the spiritual world so much. So it's said that these people that Abraham and Moses led in their times, there was many, many people in that spiritual perception and sensation of reality. And so when they approached such texts, they would be able to see through the texts, through all kinds of corporeal namings. For example, as I mentioned before, even just take the word light, and we immediately envision the light that we see coming from light bulbs, from the sun, or we define it as we said, the light of contentment upon resolving doubts, etc. So in the wisdom of Kabbalah, no word describes a corporeal phenomenon. No word describes something that we perceive in our five senses. And this is a major point, because we'll see many of such words even in Abraham's Sefer Yetzirah, many more in Moses' Torah and also in the Zohar. And it's important to understand that all these words, all this language is describing spiritual phenomena, spiritual structures and processes beyond our five senses. Spiritual meaning that we perceive those phenomena when we rise above our corporeal perception of reality and enter into the spiritual one, where we perceive through an intention, and through an intention to love and to bestow back to that source force of nature, as it has this intention to love and bestow toward us, above our egoistic desires, which want to absorb and receive naturally for self-benefit alone at every single moment. So that's what's important here, that we understand that all the Kabbalistic texts speak about that realm. And when we talk about what's relevant for us today, so the language of Kabbalah that's much more elaborated and detailed in, for example, Bala Sulam's texts, such as the Sulam commentary on the book of Zohar and the study of the Ten Sefirot. So there we have, for example, Talmud Sefirot is 6 volumes, big volumes of texts, mostly based on the Ari's writings, commentating on it, really elaborating. Also the Sulam commentary on the book of Zohar elaborate. It's many volumes of lots of text where Bala Sulam is giving very detailed commentary to these 2 major texts, the Zohar and the writings of the Ari. And what does that give us? It's not just there, as I said, it's not there for us to make all kinds of intellectual connections. It gives us lots of material through which we can draw those forces which are relevant to our era, meaning that Bala Sulam, the Ari, Rashbi, these are all Kabbalists who attained spirituality upon, as you can see, upon the bigger desires that existed in humanity in these times. Obviously, Bala Sulam upon the biggest desires out of all of them. So that's why their texts are much more suitable for us, and through Bala Sulam we get a prism for being able to approach the other texts. And that's why generally in KabU, in B'nai Baruch, the B'nai Baruch Kabbalah Education and Research Institute, we don't study texts such as Abraham's Sefer Yetzirah and Moses' Torah directly. Rather, we consider the language of Kabbalah and the Torah and even the Zohar, all those are actually, we are studying the Torah, you can say, through Bala Sulam. That is the Torah for us today. That is a Kabbalist who has organized and written the wisdom of Kabbalah, updating it and upgrading it to be suitable for this generation of people's desires. One key characteristic of our generation's desires is that we demand proof. You can see how much science and technology is developed, how much there's a much more succinct desire for proof of what we are studying as opposed to the past. What you'll find in Abraham's Sefer Yetzirah is much more general. As we said, it's a very small book, 6 small parts with not much text, and it gives some general outlines of, there's a single force, it divides into such and such subsystems, they're called this and that, and it can actually be very confusing because it starts talking about many corporeal, it uses a lot of corporeal language there, for example, fingers on our hands, air, water, wind, fire, and we can start thinking that it's actually talking about corporeal things if we don't have that attainment and preparation through these other Kabbalists. So that's why it's very important to place this context in the very beginning in order to understand that through authentic Kabbalah, the main thing is attainment, spiritual attainment, and what's important for attaining spirituality. And where does Sefer Yetzirah? You can see where it fits within that it's considered a key text, although it's not something we study directly. We do have, though, some bits and pieces of Sefer Yetzirah and what's stated there coming through us through Bala Sulam. And we'll take some of those and we'll look at those and what those explain to us. So that's what we're going to get into next. Just before that, just to more illustrate this dispute we talked about who actually wrote it. So I hope this doesn't confuse you too much, but the Bala Sulam wrote in his History of the Wisdom of Kabbalah. It's a very short article that he started writing and then which he discontinued. Most likely because it seems like it would have just stirred up a lot of arguments and without really being too beneficial. But that's our speculation. Here's what he had to say about the dispute of the author of the Sefer Yetzirah. The first book that we have in this wisdom, the wisdom of Kabbalah, is Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation, which some attribute to Abraham, the patriarch, and so it is written on its cover. However, most authors attribute it to the Tanna, Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was also around 2,000 years ago. He was the teacher, a great Kabbalist teacher of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who wrote the Zohar. So this is what Bala Sulam is saying, that Rabbi Akiva, also a very great Kabbalist, he wrote the Sefer Yetzirah. This seems to make sense, since only in his days was writing permitted in the oral Torah. Yeah, so this is why he's saying it. Hence, besides the books of the Bible, we hardly have any books that predate the generation of Rabbi Akiva, due to the known prohibition that you are not permitted to say written words out loud, and you are not permitted to write down words that are said out loud. But after the ruin of the temple and the scattering of the nation from its land, they feared that the Torah would be forgotten from Israel, so they permitted the writing, because it is time to do for the Lord. They have broken your Torah. Yeah, so just giving that as a little bit of a point here, just to show that there is a dispute on the author of Sefer Yetzirah. As you can see here, Bala Sulam started it. Bala Sulam didn't publish this article. As we said, it's a manuscript that was found among his writings, an article that he started and didn't continue with. So the main thing to take from here is just to take with a grain of salt that Abraham, although it's commonly attributed to being written by him, you see here that there's disputes here, Kabbalists among themselves, just like scientists in our world. One scientist would come up with something, another scientist will see it a different way, find some different evidence, have some different input on it and bring it up. And generally it's all positive because it adds to the general scrutiny that comes to develop the wisdom more and more. We'll move on. Okay, so we're already going to get into the first section of Sefer Yetzirah, and we'll see what we can say about it. So this is from an abridged version of Sefer Yetzirah that we have on our website at Kabbalah.info. The divine force established its rule, might, eternity, and unity through 32 secret paths of the descending upper light, and concealed itself in 3 categories: the book, the author, and the story. So this concept of book, author, and story is something that Baal HaSulam expands on at length in various places, one of the major ones being the preface to the Book of Zohar. He wrote 4 introductions to the Book of Zohar, mainly in order to prepare a person on how to approach the Zohar as a spiritual text and to understand where we are in our perception of reality and where the Zohar writes from and how to best approach ourselves in order to attain the wisdom and not just get some intellectual knowledge from it. So this is what Baal HaSulam writes in his preface to the Book of Zohar. The upper lights are called Sefer, book, as it is written in Sefer Yetzirah, part 1, chapter 1. He created his world in 3 books, a book, an author, and a story. The disclosure of the wisdom in each book is not in the white in it, but only in the colors, in the ink, from which the letters in the book, in the permutations of wisdom, come to the reader. On the whole, there are 3 kinds of ink in the book, red, green, and black. Correspondingly, the world of Atzilut, which is Chokhmah, is all godliness, like the white in the book. This means that we have no perception in it whatsoever. But the whole disclosure in the book of heaven is in the Sefirot Binah, Tiferet, and Malchut, which are the 3 worlds Bia, meaning Beriah, Yetzirah, and Asiyah, considered the ink in the book of heaven. Yeah, so there's all this talk in Sefer Yetzirah about ink, letters, 22 properties that describe and define this wisdom. So Baal HaSulam's getting into it here. What does he tell us? He talks about how the white of the book, meaning the book is this, describes the world of Atzilut, upon which the other worlds come. Sometimes we see the worlds written and shown like this, as stemming from above downward, showing how they are above us, meaning above our quality of reception, a more exalted, higher quality, which is above our minds, above our corporeal level of attainment, is these spiritual worlds here. Called Atzilut, Bria, Yetzirah, Asiyah. They're given these colors, white, just like the white on the page, he says, Chokhmah, and then the 3 inks, as it's written, the 3 colors and how it extends down. Bina, or the world of Bria, being red, Yetzirah, or Tiferet, being green, and Asiyah, or Malchut, being black. And we just illustrate this here with the barrier, or the machsom, which stands between us in this world, in our corporeal perception, and these spiritual worlds up here. Just this is for now, as we said, the Sefer Yetzirah for now for us is to get some general impressions. We can get some impression that there are these worlds that exist above ours. It's not too important at this stage, meaning at a very beginner stage, to really get into any kinds of details of these worlds. The whole wisdom of Kabbalah is a detailing and getting into all these structures of the worlds, the Sefirot, the Pratzifim up here, and that's what the wisdom of Kabbalah describes. So this is just giving some general template we can get from this, and so we can look at that at the current level right now. You should know that the white in it, which is the subject in the book, is the learned subject matter itself, while the 3 colors of the ink elucidate that subject. Yeah, so just put this other part here from Preface to the Book of Zohar. There's many parts which talk about these things, just to show that ultimately what's being described in these Kabbalistic texts in Sefer Yetzirah is that there is one force in reality beyond and behind all the other forces. Here it's expressed as the subject in the book with the white, which is like the white on a page that we can think about on books themselves. And that's the learned subject matter itself, meaning that everything in this wisdom, it's all aiming at the discovery, at the attainment of that single force which we discover when we attain that level of the world of Atzilut. While the 3 colors of the ink elucidate that subject. So everything that stems from that force, everything upon that white of the page, the 3 colors of the ink and all the different structures, letters, etc. that we write there, that is all the elucidation, it's all the clarification, the scrutiny, the examination, getting into it's how we approach that single force through our, through our vessels, and how it comes down to us. And that's the whole wisdom of Kabbalah, that there's this one force that comes towards us, it comes through many different structures, and we, from our opposite quality to that force being bestowal, our quality being reception, we move toward it and we attain all those forms upon that force, and we go through all these levels of the ink, the red, the green, the black, until we reach that final level of attainment. This is from another article by Bala Sulam, his article called Book Author Story, a very short one. This is the whole article, by the way, in Shamati. Book Author Story. A book is considered prior to creation. An author is the owner of the book. An author is the unification of the author and the book, which should assume the form of a story. That is, the Torah along with the giving of the Torah, the giver of the Torah, sorry. So what we see here is that we have this structure here. If we define these words out and how they relate to us, you can see here how, again, what's important here is this principle that's coming through the whole wisdom of Kabbalah and how authentic Kabbalah approaches things, that it's always in relevance to the person and the person's attainment of reality. So we have here the book, which is the plan of creation, which is attained at the end. Yeah, so the book, like the white on the page, it's we say that the creator, that force of love and bestowal, he envisioned and planned everything that exists in creation at the very beginning, that the thought of creation contains the whole of creation within itself. And it's outside of our attainment, but when we move through the ranks, through the levels of spirituality, until all the full attainment of spirituality, that's what we attain. We attain that plan of creation, as it says, which is attained at the end. That's book. Author is what we become. We become the author by discovering the book's author, meaning that we create a copy of the book, like a transcript, which constitutes our spiritual work. So our work in rising above our corporeal will to receive and attaining the spiritual will to bestow upon it, that's what makes us authors. And the story is what we read and record within us by changing our desires and building letters out of them. Yeah, so all the states we go through, all the situations, every time we make some effort, clarification, discernment in our spiritual work, and we apply, ultimately applying the intention to love and bestow upon our inborn desires to receive pleasure. So that's what builds this story, that us moving back toward the full plan of creation, the full attainment of that plan of creation, etc. If we move on now. Okay, just some other bits and pieces here from Sefer Yetzirah. As we said, it's mainly here for us to get some general impression, and we'll also see how Bala Sulam relates to some of these. So the 10 Sefirot of concealment of the divine force manifest in 22 principal properties, 3 root forces, 7 doubles, and 12 simple ones. The 10 Sefirot of concealment, 10 and not 9, 10 and not 11. Comprehend this by attaining the higher wisdom and be wise with understanding. Analyze and probe them, synthesize and summarize them, return the disassembled parts to their place in the divinity. So there's this concept of always saying that there are 10 Sefirot, not 9, not 11. This regularly comes back in many Kabbalistic texts. Bala Sulam refers to that in several of his articles. As we can see here, where he describes the Sefirot, and also compares that to the language, because we talked about 22 properties. The 22 properties, we know them as the Hebrew letters, that there are 22 Hebrew letters which become that ink on the page, which is describing our attainment of that white of the page, of that book, of the plan of creation. So that's a way that it's expressed towards us and how we move toward it. So all that is said in the book of Zohar and even in its legends is denominations of the 10 Sefirot called Kachab, or Keter Chochma Bina. Those are the first 3 Sefirot. Chagat, Chesed Gvura Tiferet, the next 3 Sefirot. Nehim, Netzach Hod, Yesod Malchut, the last 4 Sefirot, and their permutations. Just as the 22 letters of the spoken language, whose permutations suffer to uncover every object and every concept, the concepts and permutation of concepts in the 10 Sefirot suffice to disclose all the wisdom in the Book of Heaven. Okay, so you might have all seen this structure. This is the 10 Sefirot that we're talking about, that it's 10, not 9, 10, not 11. It shows it in this complete, compact structure. We have other lectures where we get into the Ten Sefirot in detail. Here you can just see them: Keter, Chochmah, Binah, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, Malchut. In essence, 10 qualities of the Creator and how they're expressed towards us. When we attain a certain Sefirah, we attain what's called the light. In that Sefirah, we attain Sefirah, also coming from the word illumination. It's like we hear of them as being 10 illuminations, meaning that a certain light filling a desire, when we make our desire equal to a certain level of the desire of the Creator toward us, so that constitutes attaining a certain Sefirah, as we see here in the Ten Sefirot. It's a very complicated topic because the Ten Sefirot, it's an integral structure. It's not like linearly we just attain Malchut, then we attain Yesod, then we attain Netzach, but rather everything is all integral here. And even when we study in more advanced stages in the wisdom of Kabbalah, anyone who's moved on to advanced stages of studies knows that you study in what's called a 10. It's like a group of 10 people. It doesn't necessarily need to be exactly 10 people, but it's a small structure. Similar, even in the Sefer Yetzirah, we talk about having 10 fingers, 5 fingers on each hand. There's lots of structures that are branch level expressions of these 10 Sefirot. It's hard for us to picture more than 10 people in a very deep, profound way that we can work with, and that's why we study in later stages of the wisdom in groups of 10, because we also start seeing that different people inside a group like that hold different characters by nature, and it gets very, very complicated. I'm just giving this as an example just to show that the Ten Sefirot is this very complete, complex system where the integrality of it is something that we attain time after time, and it's not something that we just move up and you're feeling this one here and that one there in a linear fashion, but it's something that we attain and move up with in an integral manner. We'll get some more impressions from this Sefer Yetzirah, see if there's anything we can also touch on here in the time we have left. 10 Sefirot of concealment. They have no beginning and no end. Their good and evil are boundless, their exaltedness and lowliness are infinite, but one divine force eternally governs all of these properties from above. Yeah, so again you can see that there's always this picture of the subsystems, sub-forces, and they're all concatenating from and leading to a single divine force, as it says here, a single force of love and bestowal, that force of the Creator. As it says here, it shows here the boundlessness of these spiritual qualities. It shows how they are beyond time, no beginning and no end. That all define the infinite. And you can see here, it's really trying to illustrate the exaltedness of what it means to attain such forces from our level upward. 10 Sefirot of concealment. Their vision is like lightning. No tongue can describe them completely, but one should discuss them again and again. Yeah, just like spiritual matters. We'll read this to the end. Research the divine force through them by the pure analysis of your speech. Yeah, so it's very interesting. No tongue can describe them completely, but one should discuss them again and again. Very similar to how we move forward in our spiritual work. We always talk about raising the greatness and exaltedness of the spiritual force of love and bestowal, and by raising the greatness and importance of it, we draw it to ourselves, and drawing that force to ourselves gives us forces in order to apply that upon our inborn will to receive, and through that we start getting a feeling of two forces, our inborn will to receive pleasure and the force of bestowal that we attract to ourselves. And through such work we come to what's called the middle line. We come to a point where we develop a sincere desire to wish to have that force of love and bestowal enter our lives, to become like it, and through that desire that we develop all the time, that's how we move forward. So as you can see here, it says that we'll never get a full appreciation of that greatness of spirituality and of that spiritual force that we attain But the more that we apply ourselves to it, as it says here, that we should discuss them again and again, even though we can never describe them completely, because that's what gives us more and more attainment of them by chewing on it, working with this material more and more. 10 Sefirot of concealment, they veil and sparkle, their end is embedded in their beginning, and their beginning in their end, like a flame in a burning coal. Their master is one divine force, and there is no other. One can only define it through its actions. Yeah, we always see this pointing back to the one force that's attained through this method and through all these sub-forces and subsystems. And we can only define it through its actions. As we said, with the Creator himself in Hebrew, Boreh, comes from the words come and see. We can only define these higher forces, these higher spiritual levels, and the one force that acts in reality by attaining it and by perceiving it through the actions it does towards us, meaning the intention of love and bestowal and how it acts through all of creation. So when we attain that, then we can define it according to our level of attainment of it. 10 Sefirot of concealment, bridle your mouth from speaking and your heart from thinking. If your lips long to utter words, and if your heart yearns to think, come to your senses, for the divine force is unattainable. Yeah, it's always beyond us, that just like we talked about, the exaltedness of this one force that created us will never get our corporeal minds to wrap it, to really feel the full appreciation of what that force is. But the more that we work in it, the more we can somewhat attain toward that force and intention toward it, that intention of love and bestowal upon our inborn desire to receive. 10 Sefirot of concealment, they conceal the divinity that rules over the lives of the low ones by force, light, wisdom, and law. 2 forces come from one and form 22 basic properties, 3 root properties, 7 doubles, and 12 simple ones. They are all filled with the same light. Again and again, we're just seeing that there's these substructures, subsystems, and above them this one force that acts throughout everything. And that brings us to the end. So this is Kabbalah Explained Simply. I'm Markos, and from here, what can you do? If you're interested in learning the authentic wisdom of Kabbalah, so we recommend taking the Kabbalah Revealed course as an initial course in KabU, and at KabU there's a smorgasbord of courses, each one from different angles. You can get into looking deeper into the Zohar, into the language of Kabbalah. You can get into these higher upper structures of spirituality and the blueprint of creation course. And there's many other things there. Another thing we do at KabU is a Q&A session, a live Q&A on Zoom after every one of these Kabbalah Explained Simply sessions each week. So if you're interested, just join the Zoom Q&A right after this, and I'll look forward to seeing you there. You just have to be a KabU member. You'll see the details for the KabU membership by clicking the links in the chat and in the description. And that's it. That's what we have time for today. I'm Markos. This has been Kabbalah Explained Simply. I look forward to seeing you next time.
Today, all of us read from the computer. We don't write letters, but we send email. We watch television and movies, which are also electronic. Everything's electronic. As if man has no need for paper. And although we still make newspapers, however, people are more and more attracted to what they see on the screen. Kabbalists used paper, a scroll, wood, or rock in order to write on it, in order to write what they have, since the written letters have a special power. And thus, a book will never lose its value, its importance, at least not the books which have to do with the spiritual, inner wisdom, in them, a person will find the internality which exists, lays in between the letters and the words, something which he will not be able to find on the screen. Why? Because this substance, the matter out of which a book is made of, and the written letters, they're against the spiritual root of book, author, story. The thought of creation and all which stems from it in the final correction, the whole process we undergo, and the happy end we come to where we reach Him and cleave on to Him, all this appears in the stories. Not to look at the wisdom that's written here, but to achieve Him, to cleave on to Him, to take on His attributes, to take His place, to achieve His thought, the thought of the author, which is the Creator. The letters and the words, something which he will not be able to find on the screen. Why? Because this substance, the matter out of which a book is made of, and the written letters, they're against the spiritual root of book, author, story. The thought of creation and all which stems from it in the final correction, the whole process we undergo, and the happy end we come to where we reach Him and cleave on to Him, all this appears in the stories. Not to look at the wisdom that's written here, but to achieve Him, to cleave on to Him, to take on His attributes, to take His place, to achieve His thought, the thought of the author, which is the Creator.